Hi everybody, welcome back. Hope everybody's doing well. The topic for today is something called screen direction. And I'm going to start with a little diagram here just to illustrate the point before we dig into the lecture notes. So let's imagine that we're shooting a scene, and I'm going to do it kind of looking down. So we have our characters, and I am a horrible artist, so these people are going to look more like birds than actual humans. And I don't know if you could see it. Maybe I should draw it larger so it is easier to see on camera. Here's our giant bird person 1. Here's giant bird person 2. Okay, now I'm going to shoot some different setups for this. So maybe I'll put one camera placement here. That'll be a wide shot. I'll put a camera here for person 1. That'll be their close-up. I'll put a camera here for person 2. That'll be their close-up. Okay, so that's the basic look. Now I'm going to erase this and draw the shots to see what they're going to look like. So we start with 1 and 2 talking to each other. Then we cut to the shot of person 1. And then we cut to the shot of person 2. All right. Now, I don't know if you can see it really well from what you're looking at, but this looks wrong, right? Person 1 was talking to person 2. They were facing each other. When I go in for the close-ups, person 1 and person 2 suddenly are not looking at each other anymore. It looks like number 2 has turned away. They don't want to talk to them anymore. But we know from when we filmed it that they were in fact talking to each other. But the problem that happened here is that when we went to the shot of person 2, we moved the camera to the wrong side of the line, which created a screen direction problem. So we're going to talk about how to fix situations like this. I need to go off camera to my other place where I'm going to sit and talk. So pay attention to the way I'm going to exit frame, by the way. This is going to be important later. So I'm going to walk this way, and then I'll catch you on the other side, okay? And here I am again. I just walked from the whiteboard to my stool. Now, of course, there's probably a continuity problem. The lights just got dim, I'm sure. But we're going to talk about that whole process of me walking from the whiteboard to sit here and how that kind of relates to screen direction in a moment. But that's our topic for today. The main thing we want to look at with screen direction is this idea of the 180-degree rule. That's the thing that kind of determines where the camera should be for a given scene. So let's kind of dig into what this is all about. First, just screen direction in general. It's the way that people move and look and face within a scene. Whenever we first establish a scene, we need to orient the audience as to what our location looks like, where people are placed in that location, how they're looking at each other. If there's a disruption to that, if suddenly somebody is where we don't expect them to be, or they're looking in a direction that seems contrary to where they should be, that's a problem. That's a screen direction problem. And the big concern here, of course, is that this is going to pull the audience out of the scene, out of the story. So we want to make sure we maintain proper screen direction to keep people engaged in the story. And the way we do that is with something called the 180-degree rule. Now, just the basics on this. Let's take a simple situation like this where you have two people sitting down. Now, they're not going to get up, they're not going to move. So what we first need to do is establish where are we going to place that first shot. Now, in this situation, let's say that's the first shot. That's the establishing shot right here at that location, at that spot. Okay, once we establish that initial camera placement, we have basically set the line for this shot. Now look at the line that runs between the two men there. Okay, that line, that's what we call the 180-degree line. Sometimes we call it the axis of action. Typically, people just call it the line. This line determines where every other camera placement should be. Because once we've established on this side of the line, then any subsequent shot needs to be on that same side. So if we shoot that over-the-shoulder shot of him right there, notice it's on this side of the line, the down side of the line. Same thing with that shot over there. When we shoot the over-the-shoulder shot of him, we keep it on the same side of the line where we established this first shot. That helps us maintain screen direction. If my first shot had been over there on that side of the room, everything would be reversed. Okay, now that's pretty simple. All we have to do is draw the line between our subjects, keep all the camera placements on one side of the line, and we're good. The problem is things aren't always so simple. Now here's just a quick diagram of what we just saw to kind of illustrate. And this is kind of like what I drew on the board, much more artistic than my drawing for sure. But you see these three camera placements, those are on the proper side of the line. In this case, the down side of the line. The one placement there, kind of like what I drew on the board, that's on the wrong side of the line. It's going to be disorienting because when we cut those two shots together, the eye lines are not going to match. We'll talk about eye lines here in a second too. Okay, so let's start talking about some complications to this situation. Okay, people aren't always going to just be sitting stationary in a room. There's going to be movement. There's going to be other people who enter the room at times. So we need to know how to deal with those changes. So let's take a look at this situation right here. In this situation, we've got two people sitting at a table. And that's kind of the standard 180-degree rule situation, right? Where we've got two people sitting, got all the camera placements on one side of the line, no problems. But what's going to happen when this guy gets up and decides to stand there to talk to her? That's going to change the line because what he's doing is he's crossing the line that was created, and now we're going to create a new line. Now, the way we determine where this new line needs to be is based on something called the pivot camera. Okay, let's say, for example, in this scene, there's a camera right here that's shooting over her shoulder at the man. So that's going to be placed right about here. This is the camera we're going to use to follow him walking over to stand at this position. So this is going to be what we call the pivot camera. As that camera right there pans to follow him, once he gets to his final spot right here, that will establish the new line. And you can see how that works down here. Here's that pivot camera on the behind side of her. It pivoted over here, creating that new line here, so we need to stay on this side. So now if we start doing shots of the woman or two shots, that's the side of the line we need to be on. Okay, so that's one situation. Probably the best way, if you do need to cross a line, let's say, for example, we're in this situation right here, and maybe they don't get up and move. Maybe they're still here, but for some reason we need to see them from the other side. The best way to do that is to physically move the camera from one side to the other, but not just move it. I mean, you're rolling the take as we move from one side to the other side, typically on a dolly. So if I dolly across from side A to side B, continuously rolling, we will now reestablish a new side of the line for the viewer, which is fine. But then what happens when we cut? Okay, once we move across that line, rolling, then we cut that shot and then go to another close-up or something. At this point, we need to stay on the B side of the line because we've reestablished on that side. That is now our new line. So any other shots will need to stay on that side as well. If we need to go back to the other side, we simply have to do another dolly shot that goes across to reestablish. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And again, it's much harder to explain this without people here in the room. So if you do have questions about any of these things, let me know. I'll try to explain it as best I can. There are other situations too. Okay, let's do this scenario. We've got two people sitting at that table. This time we have a third person enter frame. Anytime you start adding 3, 4 people to a scene and all of them are engaged with each other, they're talking, this can get tricky because new lines will start being established anytime there's new interactions between characters. Now let's try to simplify this one a little bit. Okay, so we've got the same situation we had before. Man and woman at the table talking. We've got our line established here, so that was our original line. Cameras here, here, and here. Okay, man 2 enters the scene. Okay, let's say for this situation, when man 2 enters the scene, let's say we watch that with this shot right here. Okay, so we see him enter the frame. Let's say it's a clean entrance, remember that? He enters frame clean, comes up, and starts talking to this man. And that's all being covered with this shot right here. This camera right here is the pivot camera. That's the one that's going to determine the new line. So let's say I now want to go into a close-up of this man talking to this man. Because that pivot camera was right here, because we're connecting those two men with the line, we need to stay on this side of the line. That's our working area. So the camera would be somewhere in here for that over-the-shoulder shot. If I wanted to do over-the-shoulder shot of this man, it would be somewhere in here because that's our new line. That's our new workspace. If this man suddenly starts talking to the woman, it's the same thing, right? What's our pivot camera? Let's say it's this camera again. There's our line. All the shots need to stay on this side of the line. Anytime you get 3 or more people in a scene, that line is always going to be changing. The problem is whenever you're filming, you're not always filming things in order, right? So what you need to do is really plan for all these screen direction changes that are going to take place. Because if you're just trying to kind of make this up as you go on the fly, you're going to get confused in a hurry. Where's the camera need to be when he's talking to him, talking to her? And it might even change depending on where that pivot camera was for the edit that you're making. So that's where things like camera diagrams and schematics are very useful for complex scenes to make sure that we're going to maintain screen direction throughout the scene. You got some other options as well. Let's say you've got a tricky cut where you accidentally hop the line and you don't know how to cut between those two shots without having a jarring edit. Well, one thing you might try is something called a bridge shot. A bridge shot is simply a screen direction neutral image, like this clock on the wall. There's no screen direction attached to this. So we can cut to an image like this as long as it makes sense to the story, right? You don't want to just randomly insert a shot of a clock if it doesn't mean anything to the story. But then we can cut to the next shot that's on the other side of the line, and that would mask any screen direction problems that we're going to have. Probably a lesser effective method, but this is kind of if you have no other choice. That's to do what we call cutting on action. We haven't talked about cutting on action yet. We're going to talk about that when we talk about editing. But cutting on action is simply taking one angle of a shot, cutting it to another angle of that same action, and cutting in the middle of that action. Like say I was going to throw something, I would cut from the wide shot of me throwing something halfway through the motion, cut to me closer, completing that motion, and that's what we call the cutting on action cut. Now, if you did cut in the middle of that action and you had a screen direction mistake, hopefully the motion of that movement will help mask any screen direction problems you have. But that's not ideal. Try to just follow that 180-degree rule. That will help you get through your scenes. Use bridge shots if necessary, cutting on action if necessary. But try your best to avoid those big messes like we saw on the screen, because it will pull your audience out of the story. Now, there are some times when you might hop the line for dramatic purposes, however. Here's a really good example from The Shining, where we have the camera clearly on this side of the line. So there's our line between the two men. Camera's on this side, and then suddenly we hop the line. Camera's on the back side shooting this way. But that's done for really dramatic and thematic purpose, because in this scene, what Stanley Kubrick's trying to do, he's trying to connect these two men. If you've seen the film Shining, The Shining, this man was the caretaker of the hotel before this man. This man killed his family. This man's going to try to kill his family. So when we reverse this, and suddenly now he is in the same position that he was, we find a way to kind of connect those two men thematically, symbolically. Just use this technique sparingly if you've got some kind of dramatic emphasis you need to make. But it can be a very effective technique if you choose to use it. Bottom line is, if you do cross the line, know why you're doing it. Have a reason behind it. You might see films every now and then, and you see these jumps, and it throws you off. And if it's throwing you off, it's probably a mistake. We want to have reasons behind everything we do when we make films. And screen direction's another thing we want to make sure we have reasons for. Okay, let's talk about just some other concepts related to screen direction. Okay, one thing you're going to hear quite a bit on a set is camera right, camera left. And when we talk about camera right and camera left, what that means is how things need to be oriented based on what the camera, let's say I'm the camera right here, based on what the camera is seeing. So as I'm looking through the lens, camera right for me, the director of photography, is going to be on this side, my right. Camera left is right here. So any directions I give to actors are going to be based on camera right and camera left. So let's say I need somebody to walk this way. I would say, okay, I need you to exit camera right. They're going to go off to the right side of the camera. Or I need you to look camera left. So they're going to have their eye line on this side of the camera. Now, just imagine you are looking at me right now, and I'm the camera, and I ask you to look camera left. Well, you are looking camera right, correct? Because everything's kind of reversed for you, which can get kind of tricky for actors sometimes, because you say look camera left, they maybe instinctively want to look to the left, which is incorrect. So you might at times just have to say look the other way, which is fine. But just as you're communicating with your crew, that'll be a term you hear pop up quite a bit, camera right, camera left. Okay, let's go back to me earlier at the whiteboard and then coming in to enter frame here. Okay, you might have noticed whenever I walked off frame, okay, I was walking from my right to left, and I exited frame that way. When I came into frame again, I was continuing that same consistent right to left movement. Now, if I had walked off the other side of the frame in the other shot, and then suddenly walked into this side of the frame in this shot, it would have been very disorienting because that consistent right to left or left to right movement had not been maintained from one shot to the next. It seems really simple, right? But whenever you're shooting stuff on location, you're shooting things out of order all the time. So at times it can be tricky to remember these things. You just got to be sure that you know how shots are going to cut together. And if you do have people who are entering and exiting frame, that they're maintaining consistent direction. So when we pick it up with the next shot, it's all going to flow together well. Just a side note, you might have noticed whenever I exited frame, I exited cleanly, right? I completely walked off the side of the frame until I was off camera. And then when I came back in, I was completely off camera before I entered, which makes it easy for me to cut. And we'll talk more about kind of those editing techniques in another lecture. Let's say we've got a scene where two people are needing to come toward each other. There's a famous film called Platoon, and in that film you've got a scene where there's this one American soldier, and he's moving through the forest, and he's on his own, the jungle, and he's on his own, and the Vietnamese army is coming at him. Now in this scene, of course, they shot this out of order, so they probably shot all the shots with the one soldier on one day, and then maybe even later in that day, they shot the other stuff. But you got to make sure that when you shoot it, one of the characters is going camera right, the other one's going camera left, in order to make it look like they're going to confront each other. Again, that sounds very simplistic, but in the heat of the moment, when you're shooting, these things can get complicated, and you can forget all these things, and then when you try to cut it together, it looks wrong. So just kind of keep this stuff in mind as you're trying to maintain that kind of movement, either away from each other or toward each other. This is kind of an interesting kind of phenomenon, this whole left to right movement. You see this shot here from Lord of the Rings. You see the characters moving from camera left to camera right. And if you watch this film, they've got this consistency to this. The heroes of the film are always kind of maintaining this left to right movement throughout the film. And there's purpose behind that. You think about us here in America, when we read, we're reading left to right, correct? If you play video games, if you ever have those games where they're kind of moving through frame, they're always moving left to right. That tends to have this idea of moving forward, of progression. Whenever we start moving the other way, right to left, that kind of gives the idea of we're going backwards. So this is something that it's not super important that you consider this, but you might think about this as you're shooting your own projects. If you do have a heroic figure, you might have them be going left to right. And if you have somebody who's more the antagonist, you might have them going right to left, just to kind of create that, I guess, psychological meaning to the audience that this person is to be trusted or this person is not to be trusted. Some other examples, you see this shot here from World War Z, and you see how the zombies are going that kind of upward to the left movement, whereas in Rocky, he's going upward to the right, and that's got that more powerful, heroic kind of movement to it, as opposed to this kind of destructive movement. It's just something kind of interesting to look at. It's not something that I think has to be applied to every shot of your film, but it might be something to consider. Okay, another thing that might not pop up a lot, but occasionally, if you look at these two shots of the planes, and you were to look at this shot right here or that shot, and I were to ask you, which direction is that plane flying? Well, I think probably instinctively you would think, okay, this one's flying west and this one's flying east. And who knows what direction they're flying? It doesn't matter. But there's a perception, right, because of the way we look at maps, that east is on that side and west is on that side. So that when we have these things oriented in frame, they need to be facing that proper direction. I don't know if you ever saw the film Sleepless in Seattle, but they have these shots of planes flying from Seattle to New York and New York to Seattle. And anytime the plane was flying from Seattle to New York, it would look like that. New York to Seattle, it would look like that, just to orient the audience as to what direction they're flying. Okay, we talked a little bit about eye lines, and eye lines simply refers to the direction people are looking within frame. Right now I'm looking this side of the camera, so that's going to be camera right. Okay, now I'm looking camera left, that's where my eye line's at. Now, if I were looking at another person, talking to another person, if I were looking camera right here, then we cut to the reverse shot of them looking at me. They would need to be looking camera left in order to maintain that proper screen direction. And you see that happening right here with these shots. One character looking left, one looking right. Now, whenever you set up your line and your cameras are going to be on the proper side of that line, this is just going to happen automatically. You don't even have to think about it. But if you ever do notice that people are looking the same direction, they're both looking camera right or both looking camera left, you probably can figure out you have a screen direction problem, that you put the camera on the wrong side of the line. So just be sure you maintain that kind of opposing eye line for conversations. This is kind of an interesting thing too. You can manipulate screen direction if necessary. Let's say we have a situation, and this is this exact situation right here, where you see this actress and she's in a museum and she's looking at this painting. The problem is this painting is not at this location. This painting is in a museum in Europe or something. Okay, how do we make it look like she's looking at that painting? Well, what we need to do in this situation is something called an eye line match, where we film her looking at something off screen. Of course, nothing's there. Then we go film the painting at the museum on our own, making sure that when we shoot it, it's going to match her eye lines. So what we have to do in this situation is kind of draw an imaginary line between her and this painting. So when we shoot her, let's say we're on kind of the downside of her. We need to make sure that we're on the downside of that painting when we shoot that cutaway at the museum. And then when we cut those things together, it should match, and it should look like those two things were in the same location. There's all kinds of other ways you can manipulate screen direction, and I won't try to go into it here because it's probably too complicated to talk about without having you here in the room. But there's certainly ways you can manipulate screen direction if necessary. Okay, hopefully that wasn't too complex. I know it's a little bit hard to grasp just listening to me talk and just seeing this. So I'm going to try to maybe find some video links I can send to you that further illustrate this, so hopefully it will make more sense. But if you do have more questions, let me know. Just a quick word on your lab assignment for this week. I kind of already mentioned it a little bit last time, but what you're going to do this week, everybody shot interviews last week. Now I want you to shoot the B-roll that goes along with those interviews. So the assignment is to shoot at least 20 different shots of that person doing their favorite thing. And just make sure those 20 shots relate somehow back to what they were doing. And it's really important to make sure that you have variety. I put some really specific instructions on the Moodle page. If you go down and find the favorite activity instructions and look at that, it will explain kind of specifically what I'm looking for. Like I want 2 long shots, 2 medium shots, 2 close-ups, some static shots, some moving shots. I just want variety. I want to make sure that you have a lot of selection of B-roll to choose from so that when you edit this together, you'll have sufficient footage to tell the story. So that's your assignment for this week as far as lab work. Just shoot 20, or you can shoot more if you want to, but just shoot some B-roll that goes along with that interview, and that's going to help you finish that final project that's going to be due at the end of the semester. Okay, that's all we have for this lecture. I hope everybody's doing well again. Take care. Send me messages if you have any questions. I'll see you next time.